The warmth of the fireplace did little to chase away the chill that crept down my spine as Marianne's piercing gaze fell upon me. "Well, Avery, dear, I must say that dress is interesting," she said, her ruby-red lips curling into a smile that never reached her eyes. I forced a polite grin, my cheeks flushing. "Thank you, Marianne. It's one of my favorites." "I can see why." Elliot's mother gave a tinkling laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "So bold and unique, just like you. Although I do wonder if it's quite appropriate for this family dinner." My mouth went dry as I looked at Elliot, silently pleading for him to intervene. But he just stared down at his plate, shoulders tense. "You know how much we value tradition in this household," Marianne continued, her syrupy tone a sharp contrast to the barbs in her words. "We wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable." The room seemed to shrink around me as the rest of the family remained silent observers. My vision blurred with unshed tears that I blinked back furiously. This was supposed to be a warm welcome into the Halden family after my marriage to Elliot. Instead, I felt like an ill-fitting pawn being scrutinized. "Of course, Mother," I choked out. "I'll be more mindful next time." "Wonderful." She clapped her hands together delicately. "Now, why don't you tell us a bit more about yourself, dear? We're just dying to get to know you better." I opened my mouth, but the words stuck in my throat as her cold eyes bored into me. In that moment, I realized this was about more than just my dress choice. This was Marianne establishing her dominance, a chilling power play that left me disoriented. Some distant part of me registered the uncomfortable silence stretching on until Elliot cleared his throat. "Actually, Mother, I think that's enough for tonight. Avery's had a long day." The rabbit hole didn't seem to end as the weeks ticked by in our new home. If anything, Marianne's needling demands only escalated, from explicit instructions on how to properly set the dinner table to casual comments belittling my career ambitions. And Elliot, my once loving husband, simply watched in silence as his mother's barbs chipped away at my sense of self piece by piece. It became a dizzying cycle of appeasing Marianne's every whim, lest I face the consequences of her wrath through icy rebukes or underhanded reminders of how I was an outsider here. But it was the disappointed looks from Elliot that cut deepest, each one another jagged crack spreading across the dream I had for our marriage. In those early days of our new life together, I was drowning, gasping for air in a twisted game I didn't know the rules to, and Marianne seemed determined to keep me unbalanced through her sinister passive aggression, all while wearing a sickly sweet smile, of course, because that was the Halden family way. At first, the changes in Elliot were so subtle, I easily chalked them up to the stress of starting our new life together. A forgotten birthday here, a canceled date night there, small things that I excused as just part of getting into a new groove as newlyweds. But soon, those slight oversights spiraled into something darker, something that made my heart clench every time I saw the disappointment and disdain hardening in his eyes. "This pot roast is dry as a bone," he grumbled one night, jabbing his fork moodily into the meat. "Honestly, Avery, how many times do I have to show you?" I opened my mouth, then snapped it shut as Marianne swept into the dining room. Now, Elliot, that's no way to speak to your wife." Her nostrils flared as she pinned me with an icy stare, although Avery should know better by now. The lump in my throat threatened to choke me as I looked at Elliot pleadingly, desperate for him to defend me like he used to. But he just shrugged, already shoveling another forkful of the dry pot roast into his mouth. That night was only the beginning. Pretty soon, Elliot's callous comments became as commonplace as Marianne's constant critiques of my abilities as a wife and daughter-in-law. He'd track mud into the house and then snap at me for not anticipating his needs. I'd burn dinner, and he'd throw the plate across the kitchen in a rage. All the while, Marianne watched like a hawk, her curved lips stretching into a satisfied smile every time Elliot willingly played his role. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks one afternoon when I foolishly asked Elliot if he wanted to grab lunch together before his next meeting. "Don't be ridiculous," he scoffed, already shrugging on his suit jacket. "You know Mother prefers I'm back promptly after appointments to discuss business matters." My heart plummeted into my stomach as I watched him hurry out the door, not even a backward glance in my direction. That's when the harsh truth finally clicked into place. Marianne had enveloped us so fully in her twisted web that Elliot was utterly beholden to her every rule. My husband was a shell of his former self, his love for me dulled by years of psychological conditioning at his mother's hand, and I was slowly being suffocated by her ruthless control over our family, gasping for air in a life I no longer recognized. "Oh, Avery, you're pouting again." Marianne's sickly sweet voice rang out from behind me. I spun around, jaw clenched, as she sicked loudly and shook her head. "When will you learn?" In that moment, something inside me twisted and snapped. I could no longer swallow down the bitter truth. If I stayed on this path, Marianne would grind me into the dirt until I was a vacant, submissive shadow of my former self. Just like Elliot. No, that was not the life I wanted. Not for me. Not for anyone. And as I met her cold gaze steadily, a new flame of determination was lit from the dying embers inside me. If Marianne wanted a battle, she would get one, with everything I had, because this time I would be the one calling the shots. The annual Halden Family Charity Gala was supposed to be a lighthearted affair, a chance for the town's elite to mingle and pat themselves on the back over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. But this year would be different. This year, I had a plan. As I descended the staircase in my crisp azure gown, clutching Elliot's arm, I saw Marianne's eyes narrow ever so slightly. Her well-practiced smile wavered just for an instant before settling back into that familiar saccharine mask. "Why, Avery? You clean up nicely," she purred as we reached the bottom of the stairs. "Although I do wish you'd done something a bit more sophisticated with your hair." My grip on Elliot's arm tightened, but he remained stoically impassive, refusing to even look at me, just like I knew he would. The night blazed on in a whirlwind of fake laughter and insincere compliments that made my skin crawl. I smiled woodenly, one hand clutching my champagne flute like a lifeline, as Marianne's barbs continued unchecked. "It really is too bad you never finished your college degree, dear," she said loudly during Aovek, her voice carrying across the crowded ballroom. We Haldens do so value a prestigious education. A hush fell over our little group as I felt dozens of eyes boring into me, awaiting my stuttered excuse like they'd grown accustomed to over the years. But not this time. This time, the anger roaring in my ears drowned out any shred of remaining intimidation. "Actually, Marianne, I seem to recall you dropping out as well," I said coolly, taking a dainty sip of my champagne. "To start a family, was it?" Her perfectly lined lips parted in shock as hushed murmurs began rippling through our audience. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of Elliot's father, Douglas, suppressing a grin before Marianne's voice sliced through the tension again. "Well, I never. You'd do well to watch your tone, young lady," she hissed, color blooming high on her cheeks. "I've half a mind to." "To what, Marianne?" I cut her off, something inside me finally snapping free. "Continue your sad attempts to belittle and control me? Save your breath, because I'm simply done playing your twisted little games." I leveled my gaze at Elliot, who shrank back, a deer in the headlights. "Or has your mother not told you about her plans to remove me from your lives? To wipe me from the picture completely so she can find you a more suitable bride to further the Halden legacy?" An icy silence hung in the air, punctuated only by Marianne's ragged breathing as her mask shattered completely. I could taste the fear rolling off her in dizzying waves, smell the acrid stench of her desperation. The crowd seemed to sway around me as I looked from Elliot's pale, stricken face to Marianne, and then to Douglas, the first inkling of hope in his eyes for longer than I could remember. With a sickening lurch, the weight of my entrapment these past few years finally hit me like a physical blow. The lies, the belittling, the silent torment, all at the hands of this vile woman and her puppet of a son. Something inside me finally broke free as the last threads of fear dissolved away, replaced by a calmness I hadn't felt in years. A foreign power seemed to uncurl within me, urging me not to flee this time, but to stand my ground. To fight. The whispers were growing louder now, but I barely heard them over the roaring in my ears as I tossed back the last of my champagne and smiled at Marianne. "No, I'm afraid the games are just beginning." The deafening silence that followed my outburst at the gala was finally broken by the harsh clack of Marianne's heels as she stormed away, her face twisted into a mask of rage. Elliot trailed after her, throwing me one last haunted look before disappearing into the crowd. I stood rooted to the spot, my heart thundering in my ears as the world slowly bled back into focus. Hushed whispers and scandalized gasps swirled around me, but I barely registered them over the chorus of voices in my mind. What had I done? After years of keeping my head down, something had snapped inside of me in that heated moment. An overwhelming urge to shatter the heavy silence, to unravel this twisted tapestry Marianne had woven around our family. Trembling, I turned to Douglas, the first man I'd ever seen stand up to his domineering wife. He placed a wizened hand on my arm, his eyes shining with the first hint of resolve I'd witnessed in years. "You did the right thing, Avery," he murmured gruffly. "The truth had to come out, no matter how ugly." His earnest words should have been a balm, helping ease the searing guilt and shock pulsing through my veins. But they did little to chase away the nagging sense of dread coiling in the pit of my stomach, because I knew this was only the beginning. My grand public outburst may have rattled Marianne's cage, but the real fallout was yet to come. She would retaliate, of that I was certain, which meant I needed to be prepared to fight back with everything I had. That realization was what finally spurred me into action over the next few days, as the harsh condemnations and scandalized whispers engulfed our family. While Elliot holed up in his study in a drunken stupor, I began to gather what little evidence I could. Damning financial statements, detailing the misappropriation of Halden family funds, sworn affidavits from Marianne's hired staff recounting her unhinged verbal tirades, a trove of secret recordings spanning years, each one more incriminating than the last. I compiled my case meticulously, letting the smoldering embers of my anger drive me forward as I prepared for the battle to come. Because one thing had become painfully clear. Marianne would stop at nothing to regain control over her kingdom, and I would be her prime target. The breaking point came one night after another of Elliot's inevitable blow-ups, his voice hoarse from screaming about the humiliation I'd brought upon this family. I had hidden in the pantry, my breath coming in raggedy pants as his venomous words hit their mark again and again, until finally I heard the telltale click of Marianne's heels against the hardwood and the murmur of their hushed conversation filtering through the cracked door. "Get rid of her." Marianne's low, steely voice made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "She's become much too unruly, much too dangerous to our family's interests." Unable to contain myself a moment longer, I leaned in closer until their poisonous whispers became clear as day. And that's when I heard the evidence I'd been subconsciously seeking all along. The final, damning confession that any shed of humanity had long been snuffed out in this family. The gloves were off. The time for playing Marianne's twisted games was over, because now it was my turn to fight fire with fire. As the whispered threats from Marianne and Elliot's hushed confession echoed in my mind, a strange calmness washed over me. No more walking on eggshells, no more forcing smiles as I was pecked apart from the inside. This was war, and I would be ready. The next morning, I awoke before dawn and quietly slipped out of the house before Elliot or Marianne could stir. My footsteps were the only sound on the deserted downtown streets as I made my way to the one place I knew I could find allies, Everly's Diner. The tinkling of the bell above the door was like a soothing balm as the familiar scents of bacon and freshly brewed coffee enveloped me. This place had been my haven in those first few strained years of marriage, when I could still escape Marianne's clutches for a few blessed hours. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customer!" Janice, the owner, emerged from the kitchen, a hesitant smile playing across her lips, as she took in my undoubtedly haggard appearance. "Rough night, hon? You could say that." The words were already tumbling out before I could stop them. The revelations at the gala, the whispered threats, my finally reaching the breaking point. As I spilled everything, I watched Janice's eyes widen, one wrinkled hand flying to cover her mouth. "Oh, darlin', I always knew that woman was nothin' but a snake," she muttered, shaking her head slowly. "But to go that far, to actually try hurting you like that, that's a new low, even for her." An unexpected surge of relief coursed through me at her words, as if finally hearing someone else validate my pain and experiences made it all just a little more bearable. I opened my mouth, about to try explaining myself further when the bell above the door jangled again. "There you are." A familiar voice rang out as Lila, my best friend from college, rushed over and enveloped me in a bone-crushing hug. "Janice called and told me everything. Avery, I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you all this time. If I'd known what was really going on." Her voice cracked with emotion, and I instinctively tightened my arms around her. Lila had been the closest thing to family I had in those first few years of my marriage before Marianne's isolating tactics finally pushed her away. "You're here now," I murmured, forcing a watery smile as she finally pulled back. "That's what matters." "Damn straight." Lila swiped away the tears trickling down her cheeks before squaring her shoulders determinedly. "So what's the plan, Av? How can I help take that bitch down?" My lips twitched in a real smile this time at the fierce protectiveness blazing in her eyes. Because that's exactly what I needed now, someone with claws out who was ready to fight. "Well, for starters, I need to gather more evidence," I began, the gears in my mind already turning. "Anything I can use to expose Marianne and get these people off my back once and for all." I was thinking... "You were thinking it's time to play a little hardball," a new voice cut me off. I turned to see Charlie, my friend Lila's older brother and a hotshot corporate lawyer, sweeping into the diner. A slow grin spread across his face as he took in my questioning look. "Leela called me from the road," he explained with a shrug. "Said my brilliant college pal was finally ready to stand up for herself. So," he rubbed his hands together, "what kind of trouble are we stirring up?" As I laid out the pieces I'd gathered so far, I could feel the weight temporarily lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't alone in this fight. I finally had people, friends, in my corner who were ready to go to battle. No more passive silence, no more turning the other cheek as Marianne and her minions sought to drown me. This time, I would be the one putting up a fight. This time, the predators would become the prey. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of clandestine meetings and furtive evidence gathering as Lila, Charlie, and I built an airtight case against Marianne and her web of deceit. Papers were meticulously organized into binders. Undercover surveillance captured hushed confrontations and damning admissions. A steely sense of determination took root inside me, unfurling with each incriminating piece we unearthed. By the time the annual Halden Hospitality Charity Gala arrived, I could feel the palpable tension thrumming through my veins. This would be the moment of truth, the culmination of weeks of secret planning, my chance to cut through the smothering silence once and for all. "You've got this, Lila murmured as we did final checks in the courthouse bathroom. Her fingers deftly fluffed my hair as her gaze met mine in the mirror, a silent message passing between us. No more fear, no more games. When we emerged into the marbled lobby a few minutes later, the gilded ballroom was already buzzing with Woodbrook's elite in their tuxedoed finery. Champagne flutes glinted under the soft candlelight as mingled laughter and chatter filled the air. I could feel hundreds of eyes trailing over me as I deliberately wove through the crowd, clutching the overflowing case binder to my chest like a shield. A hush seemed to fell over the crowd with each step, until finally I reached the center of the polished dance floor. "Good evening, everyone," I said in a clear, ringing voice, flashing them all a brilliant smile. "I'd like to take a moment to celebrate the generous philanthropists in our community who have gone to such great lengths to give back." A smattering of hesitant applause followed along with a few bewildered looks. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched Marianne stiffen, the color draining from her perfectly made-up face. "Of course," I continued lightly, "there are a few individuals here tonight who have been rather generous with their philanthropy, shall we say." As I spoke, I deposited the binder on a nearby table with a dull thud and began paging through the damning evidence. Embezzling funds from local charities and family trusts to fuel lavish lifestyles and keep up appearances, betraying the trust and confidence of those who believed in their philanthropic integrity. My voice remained maddeningly calm, even as Marianne's face contorted with rage and panic flickered in Elliot's eyes. As more and more details tumbled from my lips, a deafening silence fell over the crowd, broken only by the flutter of papers and my inexorable narration. "Then, of course, we have the less legal dalliances to account for as well." I leveled my gaze squarely at Elliot now, holding up glossy photographic proof of his indiscretions for all to see. Cavorting with strange women, deceiving his faithful wife, all while hiding behind this thin veneer of community-minded chivalry. The hushed gasps of shock seemed to reverberate against the vaulted ceilings now, shattered only by the guttural scream that finally tore free from Marianne's throat. Wild-eyed and trembling, she looked every bit the caged animal as security began closing in from all sides. In that crystalline moment of reckoning, I could see the final shreds of her meticulously constructed facade disintegrating into ash right before me. There would be no more lies, no more manipulations under the guise of propriety. For the first time since she'd callously destroyed my naive dreams of familial belonging all those years ago, I felt a savage sense of victory coursing through my veins unfettered. The karmic wheel had finally turned, and Marianne was powerless to stop it. As two burly guards moved to apprehend her, Marianne's gaze found mine one final time, feral and burning with hatred. But this time her venom held no power, sliding harmlessly away as the last of the fear dissolved inside me, because in that moment I was the master of her supposed checkmate. The thunderous silence that followed Marianne's dramatic arrest seemed to stretch into eternity. I could taste the collective shock and disbelief like a palpable force as the once venerable Halden family imploded before their eyes. For a fleeting moment, Elliot and I locked gazes across the ballroom floor. His expression was utterly inscrutable, eyes hollow and glazed as twin trails of moisture streaked his ashen cheeks. Then, just as quickly as the spell had woven between us, it shattered, splintering into 1,000 unspoken recriminations and shards of dashed hopes. Elliot's jaw hardened and he turned on his heel, retreating into the claustrophobic crowd as if I were the villain here, as if I had been the jackal systematically stripping our family apart, piece by piece. The bitter taste of defeat nearly choked me until a warm hand came to rest on my shoulder. I turned to see Douglas, the shrunken shell of a man suddenly seeming decades older than his years. "You did what you had to do," he murmured, his words barely audible over the rising din of panicked murmuring. "She left you no choice." A knot I didn't realize I'd been carrying seemed to loosen ever so slightly at his reassurance. For so long, he had been just another one of Marianne's puppets, helpless against the manipulations of his monstrous wife. But now, in the wake of this cataclysmic shake-up, I could see the first faint flickers of hope rekindling in his rheumy eyes. The iron manacles were finally loosening. "For what it's worth, I'm sorrier than you'll ever know," Douglas continued hoarsely, gnarled fingers tightening around my arm in a vice grip. "Marianne, she was always the strong one, the immovable force, and I let myself become malleable, too cowed to ever stand up to her toxic ways until it was far too late." His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, face etched with regret. "You didn't deserve any of what she put you through, Avery. But maybe now, maybe there's a chance to start fresh." I could only nod numbly, too overwhelmed to find any words of forgiveness or comfort. Because in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his shattered legacy, Douglas was beyond consoling. No, there would be no easy path forward now, not for any of us. The Halden family as we'd known it was irreparably broken, the bedrock foundation built on lies and deceit. As the gaping crowd parted like the Red Sea, Marianne reappeared between her two hulking security escorts. No longer the impeccably coiffed ice queen, her coppery hair askew and mascara streaking her crimson cheeks in muddy rivulets. But her slate eyes still gleamed with that familiar vindictive light as they bored into me. "You ungrateful, malicious little cur," she spat, the haunting words cutting through the silent ballroom. "After everything I sacrificed for this family, gave you people so you could keep living in your pathetic delusions of grandeur." One of the guards made a move to silence her, but Marianne merely wrenched free, her lips peeling back in a manic snarl. "Don't think this is over. You hear me, Avery? I'll make you regret the day you ever set foot in this town and tried to sully the Halden name." Her vicious threats hung in the air like a dark miasma as I watched the sad, broken remnants of her once imperious persona be dragged away. No, this was far from over, I realized with a chill. Marianne's stubborn claws would remain sunk in deep, poisoning any chance at peaceful resolution until her dying breath. As the ballroom seemed to gradually swirl back into motion around me, The first tangled threads of uncertainty began weaving their way through my momentary vindication. Because one thing had become resoundingly clear: there would be no clean slates here. No easy path to redemption or letting go of the past. Not when it came to the deep, soul-scarring rift Marianne had rent into our fractured family. The only path forward now was to finish what I'd started, no matter how ugly the finale. The months following the cataclysmic unraveling of the Halden family legacy were a cyclonic blur. Attorneys, court appearances, endless hearings, it all bled together into a surreal waking dream as I weathered the fallout. True to her malicious vow, Marianne fought tooth and nail against the charges, her snarling defiance echoing through oak-paneled courtrooms like the unrelenting screeches of a wild animal. Evidence be damned, she seemed determined to drag us all down into her scorched-earth spiral of destruction before finally admitting defeat. But in the end, the truth proved insurmountable. The house of lies she'd so meticulously constructed came crumbling down in an avalanche of convictions and seized assets. I could only look on in muted triumph as the once untouchable Marianne Halden was led away in shackles, her raging accusations buried under the weight of her own hubris. For Elliot, there could be no easy escape from his silent complicity either. Faced with his own damning trail of evidence, adulterous entanglements, misused funds, illegal business dealings, my husband eventually accepted a plea deal. His sentence was lighter than his mother's, but the cost was steep nonetheless. Public humiliation, hefty fines, and a lifetime of untangling his father's ravaged business affairs. As for Douglas, the tragic patriarch displayed a weariness that went far beyond his years as the curtain closed on this ugliest of family dramas. He retreated from the prying eyes of the community, content to quietly pick up the pieces of his shattered empire alone. Well, not entirely alone, for in a gesture I never could have foreseen, he summoned me to his study one rain-swept evening with an unexpected offering, a shocking sum of restitution and an even more stunning apology. You never deserved the venom my wife unleashed, nor my own cowardice in enabling her toxic behavior, he rasped, calloused fingers caressing a worn photograph of family happier times. But I hope this can be a step towards making amends for the suffering you endured on my watch. I opened my mouth to protest, but Douglas raised a withered hand, his eyes shimmering with a fragile hope. Take it, Avery. For once in your life, take something you never had to fight tooth and nail for. Build yourself a legacy untainted by the rot of this family. His gruff words should have felt like a balm after such harrowing turmoil. And yet, as I accepted the oversized check with trembling hands, my heart felt strangely hollow, because no amount of reckoning or restitution could ever absolve the scars that had been carved into my soul by this once revered family. Those wounds would never fully heal, I realized with a pang of melancholy. Even now, stripped of their wealth and clout, the Haldens maintained an invisible hold over me, their ghosts lingering in the farthest reaches of my psyche, like insidious wraiths. But rather than allowing their toxic legacy to tighten around me once more, I would take Douglas's offering and finally forge my own path forward. So as the weeks and seasons gradually shifted once more, I did just that. Carefully channeling the still smoldering embers of anger simmering within, I began investing and planning, slowly, meticulously building my own empire from the ashes of the old. It started small, just a little community arts program for underprivileged youth that had been a lifelong dream. Then, as my nest egg blossomed into more ambitious ventures, the initiatives multiplied. Before long, I was able to establish a formidable foundation in my own name, dedicated to empowering women who had faced abuse and marginalization at the hands of toxic power structures. With every new achievement and hard-won victory, I could feel the icy grip of the past gradually loosening its hold over my battered soul, the all-consuming rage and thirst for vengeance slowly giving way to a renewed sense of purpose and strength from within. It would be naive to think the scars could ever fully fade, that the haunting specter of Marianne's abuse wouldn't still linger in the darkest recesses of my heart, appearing in my most vulnerable moments like a malevolent phantasm. But now, finally, I had reclaimed the power to exorcise those demons in whatever form they took. The cycle of toxicity had been broken once and for all, replaced by the first blushes of a new day. a day where I was no longer just surviving, but finally thriving as the master of my own rebirth.